Good morning, everyone. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. We're going to give folks just a few minutes here to hop on before we dive in. All right, good morning, everyone. We're just giving folks a couple more seconds to log on before we get started. All right, welcome everyone to the third module in our six-part series on adapting or adopting high quality instructional materials. We are focused today on math specifically and are really excited to dig in. And before we do, we just have a quick reminder that the recording of today's webinar will be available by Monday on the Strong Start page on TEA's website. And we're also going to put the link into the chat now so that you can go there. And we ask that you use the Q&A feature throughout this webinar to ask any questions that you might have so that we can be sure that they are answered during the appropriate time. And for those of you who are able to join us for Module 1, some of these spaces might look familiar. And for those of you just joining us this morning, my name is Kelsey Hendricks, and I'm the Senior Director of Custom Services at Instruction Partners. I'm joined today by our Math Teaks guru, Cami Mabry, our Senior Lead for Math, and our Managing Director of Instructional Support for all of our Texas partners, Brian Hearn. And for those of you just joining us today, here is the scope of the 6 modules. In previous sessions, we've provided guidance on designing for instructional quality, coherence, and continuity in Module 1. And then in Module 2, earlier this week, participants dove deeper into adapting or adopting pre-K curriculum. All of our previous sessions are posted on the Strong Start website that you can find in the chat. And today we're going to be discussing the criteria for adopting or adapting math curriculum for remote settings. We'll specifically focus on identifying quality considerations for adoption of curricula in math, for prioritizing considerations for adaptation of curriculum in math, and then engage in an example adaptation for distance learning, and identify some next steps to operationalize those adaptations for math curriculum. We also want to name that we would not typically be talking about adopting or even adapting your curriculum at the end of July, right? And this is a conversation that we're having because of COVID and the need to have instruction that can be used both remotely and in person. We'll begin our time together in an opening and a framework overview before diving into a case study and some application, and then a Q&A on the specific pieces around adapting and adopting for our math curriculum. And so the beginning portion of this webinar will not be focused on Texas Home Learning 3.0, but after we do go through those considerations, TEA will be previewing some more specifics regarding THL 3.0, including the LMS, and they'll hold time for specific Texas Home Learning questions at the very end of this webinar. And I believe we just re-chatted out the link to the website where you'll be able to find the recording of today's webinar, as well as modules 1 and 2. And we know that due to our current reality of the pandemic and the likelihood that schools will continue to be in flux this year, every teacher in Texas is going to be asking the same questions this fall. How do I make sure all of my students experience high quality, TEKS-aligned instruction, regardless of their learning environment or their level of connectivity? And second, how do I accomplish that without seeing all or some of my students in person every day? And in order to really think about the process of adapting or adopting our math curriculum, we want to ground ourselves this morning in a 5th grade TEKS. The task that you see on your screen aligns to standard 5.2b, which is a readiness standard. I'd like for you to take a moment to read the task, and if you'd like, try it out this morning. So with this task, we're expecting students to compare decimals to the thousandths, order decimals to the thousandths, and arrange numbers in decreasing order. I'd like for you to keep this task in mind throughout our session today. We're going to continue to refer back to this TEKS or this TEK at hand when teaching this particular content. And we're going to model later on how you might specifically plan for the unfinished learning that will likely occur has likely occurred due to closures in the spring. We also want to make sure that we have a common understanding of what we want to expect in a math classroom. Math at its most basic level is a network of nodes, of active sense making, a balance of concepts, procedures, and application. And it's not a linear path of learning, input of knowledge, or a checklist of discrete skills. Assuming then that we have high quality instructional materials in math, we can go a bit further to include that math is a place where all students have access to grade level content, where unfinished learning is addressed in service of the grade level TEKS, that teachers check for understanding and misconceptions, students receive feedback on their work, students own their learning, and that Tier 2 supports Tier 1 instruction. It's important to note that while there's unfinished learning every year, we know that this will continue to be the case as we move forward into this next year. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who will share more about some key considerations for quality math materials adoption.
Thanks, Kelsey. There are several hundred of you on the call today. I'm really honored to be able to speak with you today about key considerations for quality math materials adoption. And in Module 1, we explored the decision-making process for how your district might determine if y'all want to adapt your current materials to meet the definition of high-quality instructional materials and the needs of remote settings, or whether you should think about adopting a new set of high-quality instructional materials. And the high-quality instructional materials, as we went over on Module 1, can solve for the many challenges faced by Texas leaders and teachers across the spring. One challenge that we heard from educators across the state of Texas was that teachers who were developing their own curriculum had a difficult time adjusting to remote learning this spring, even though everyone was working incredibly hard for their students. But high-quality instructional materials can alleviate the burden of designing lessons so that teachers can focus more on how to adapt their curriculum to work both in person and remotely, and also better support students with diverse needs. A second set of challenges that we heard was that leaders needed to navigate multiple sets of resources to support teachers. High quality instructional materials can make it easier for principals, coaches, also district leaders to support all teachers despite the changing teaching and learning scenarios. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, a third challenge is that schools are relying on groups of adults to provide a truly unprecedented amount of student support, care, and guidance. And high quality instructional materials can provide some consistency and predictability for those supporting students while teachers remain the core instructors. So as we went over in Module 1, it's important that we ground in a common definition of high quality instructional materials. What do we mean by that? So here's a sample checklist that can help y'all evaluate your current curriculum, as well as define what we want to see in our materials to meet the needs of remote learning. So first, and most importantly, do we have that TEKS-aligned content? Secondly, support for all learners, including students with disabilities and emerging bilingual students. Third, support for content connections. Fourth, built-in progress monitoring in the materials themselves, and fifth, support for educators, including support for unfinished learning. These 5 components are truly the bedrock of high quality instructional materials, regardless of the context that we're in. But however, we know that we're in a very unusual context right now, and that students are going to be moving in and out of learning scenarios significantly. And that's likely going to be a routine feature of this upcoming school year. And so to maximize student learning in spite of this difficult context, materials also need to include usability both on campus and in a virtual remote setting, and then usability and additional supports for families. So a high quality curriculum addresses these requirements, and the last 2 in orange there are even more critical in this current reality. And we also want to make sure we name exactly what we're referring to when we're talking about unfinished learning. Most simply put, it's any prerequisite skills or knowledge that students need for future work that they haven't yet acquired. And I know that y'all know that every year there are students who require support in addressing unfinished learning. And I bet it's top of mind for the hundreds of you on this call as you expect that this challenge will be felt even more prominently in the 2020-2021 school year. But we know also that all too often, unfinished learning leads to remediation or pull-out intervention that only serve to further isolate students and impede their access to rigorous, engaging, TEKS-aligned grade level content. And that's similar to what you see in the top graphic, where the first 9 weeks of school are used simply to teach last year's content. But instead, you should think about unfinished learning in context. So keeping the focus on grade level content and rigor, and addressing unfinished learning with just-in-time support, as you can see in this second graphic here. So importantly, when we're thinking about unfinished learning, we're really thinking about how we ensure that all students have the conceptual understanding that's necessary for students to engage with the expectations of the grade level. For example, if I'm a 7th grade math teacher who's teaching 2-step equations, my task in addressing unfinished learning is deeper than just teaching the 6th grade 1-step equation, just in case. Instead, I should hone in specifically on the conceptual understanding required for that 7th grade skill as a just-in-time support, understanding an equation. So additional information about high quality instructional reviews in math is available through the Texas Resource Review website, texasresourcereview.org. And here you can find the K-8 quality review rubric, which further details some of the features of high quality math materials in Texas. Some math products are currently under review and detailed reports will be released later this year. And we'll follow the same guidelines in naming those key considerations for adopting high quality instructional materials for math. Now, again, we know that typically we would not be thinking about adopting new materials right now at the end of July, but we all know we are not working in typical times right now. And the reality is we need to plan for what will be best for our students in the fall. And as system leaders, y'all know that this is going to require some really difficult and time-sensitive decisions that we would normally not take on this late into the summer. And so for math specifically, district and school leaders are asking these following questions to determine quality in materials. So the first is alignment. Are the materials aligned to the grade level TEKS and the ELPs? Content and instructional concepts. Do the materials include coherent use of models and strategies to support grade level conceptual development? Do the materials integrate the process standards throughout the lesson? And are students encouraged to problem solve independently? I know that's something that we all want in our classrooms. And then educator support. Are supports built in to ensure that all students, including our emerging bilingual students, or students with disabilities, can they access grade level content? And are there supports for families, especially now in the event that students are working remotely? And finally, we consider technology and the ability to transfer between in-person and remote settings, and then also the professional development provided to teachers. So these are just a couple of the key considerations to be thinking about as we adopt high quality instructional materials for math, if you choose to go down that route. Module 6 in our sessions will go a bit further into how to complete the adoption of new materials, but here are the action steps necessary when thinking about operationalizing the decision to adopt. Given the reality that we're in and it's late July, your district might think about prioritizing the final 3 actions on the blue boxes. I'll give folks a chance to read this chart here. So those last 3 boxes around completing the review of materials, deciding what to adopt, and then organizing next steps are crucial. And you can see for this particular district who they assign to really own those action steps as they operationalize this decision on a quick timeline. So we know that time is limited, school is scheduled to start soon, and if y'all choose to adopt a new math curriculum this fall, you'll want to ensure that your time and effort are well spent. And so to ensure you have high quality instructional materials for math that will meet the needs of your students, regardless of their learning environment, these 4 things must be present. TEKS aligned content that's rigorous and that there's coherence from grade to grade, as well as in between instructional settings. Independent problem solving is evident throughout, and there are additional supports, instructional supports and usability for all students and families. And so in addition to these key criteria for high quality math materials, you'll also want to ensure that these resources are usable both on campus and in a remote virtual setting. So I'm going to turn it over to my teammate Cami to share a little bit more about adapting for instructional quality, coherence, and continuity.
Thanks, Brian. This school year will be like no other year we've ever seen. Due to COVID-19 and spring school closures, students will be returning with more significant gaps. The potential for more school closures and students learning remotely will continue to be top of mind for our school leaders. In addition to all of that, there's the stress this pandemic has caused to our students, our teachers, our staff, and our community. With that in mind, we will model how district leaders can take the time now to adapt their current high quality instructional materials to meet the demands of remote instruction and intentionally plan for unfinished learning. Once the district has determined their materials meet the criteria for high quality instructional materials, including usability between in-person and remote learning, they will then have to consider what adaptations will be necessary to meet the demands of this particular school year. We may have amazing resources, but prior to this summer, no resource intentionally planned to meet the needs we currently face. Students have been displaced. And no matter how hard teachers and schools tried in the spring, instruction was impacted. Regardless of how strong you think your material is, schools and system leaders will need to prepare for how we will adjust the scope and sequence to account for unfinished learning caused by COVID-19. How do we ensure that conceptual understanding and development exist in a remote setting? How will teachers and students access manipulatives and visual models fluidly between remote and on-campus learning environments? How will teachers progress monitor seamlessly throughout different instructional settings? Like the science framework we shared in Module 1, the math framework will help you answer 3 questions. What is the priority content? How do we plan for unfinished learning? And what do we need to consider when planning for the instructional setting? Our priority is that all students engage with new learning related to their current grade level across instructional settings. We then consider and plan for unfinished learning heightened by COVID closures, and finally plan for the instructional setting, thinking about quality, coherence, and continuity across all pieces of this framework. Before walking through this model, I want to name up front that you are the people making these difficult decisions. While we are not the individuals who answer these challenging questions at a system level, we work in close partnership with many districts such as yours. So as I narrate through this decision-making process, I want you to imagine I am your district's math curriculum coordinator. To model exactly how we will adapt currently used high-quality instructional material, we're going to go through the process with a specific example from 5th grade. As you see, this is the scope and sequence for Unit 1 of 5th grade. We're going to refer back to this scope and sequence throughout our demonstration. At a district level, we first reviewed our curricular resources using the checklist presented in Module 1. We needed to assess if we're even starting with high quality instructional materials that also account for our new reality of transitioning seamlessly between in-person and remote settings. And what we found is that our materials are TEKS aligned. They do offer supports for all learners. There is coherence and connections from previous grades. It has assessments, progress monitoring opportunities. It offers teachers' guides and lines of questionings. They also have videos that families can access for support. And ultimately, the most important part is we can easily upload materials to our LMS. After reviewing our curricular resources up against these metrics, we've identified our materials as high quality. But upon further reflection, we realized one element was not fully addressed. When we considered the support for educators, specifically the support for unfinished learning, we went back in and looked at our teacher materials more closely. And although there are scaffolds built in to provide basic support for unfinished learning, we haven't encountered unfinished learning like this. How will we account for the unfinished learning due to last spring's school closure? If we're honest, there's always an element of unfinished learning that we need to adjust for. But this year, that is going to be more prevalent than ever before. We currently face a reality that no matter how good our current materials are, they will not specifically address the unfinished learning from last spring and the probability of continued school closures due to new outbreaks this fall. So the question is, how can we prepare our materials and our teachers now to address the gaps that may arise? Before we can adapt the material for unfinished learning, we need to ask ourselves, what is the priority content in 5th grade math? And when students leave 5th grade, what do we want to ensure that they have learned in this math class? Here, we looked at the introduction to grade 5 and identified that the primary focal areas in 5th grade are solving problems involving all 4 operations with positive rational numbers, determining and generating formulas and solutions to expressions, and extending measurement to area and volume. Ideally, we will cover much more than these 3 key areas, but with the reality that we're facing with COVID-19 and the potential for continued remote learning throughout this year, we want to be better prepared this fall than we were in the spring. Regardless of how good the high quality materials are, we will not be able to adequately cover all the content in the yearly scope and sequence. Therefore, we're going to look at each unit and prioritize the lessons to meet these 3 focal areas for 5th grade. After identifying that this unit does target priority content, which is solving problems involving all 4 operations with positive rational numbers, specifically decimals, our district level math curricula team will assess each of the TEKS listed in the scope and sequence and answer 2 questions. First, is there a skill from the previous grade's TEKS that is necessary for students to have access to the current grade level material? Then we're going to ask, does this skill require more time or an additional resource? It is important to note here that while we are adapting this high quality material, we are cautious to not over adapt. We do not want to cut key material and we do not want to simplify the content. Our goal is to determine how we can make adjustments to the implementation of the material without lowering the expectation from students. We will use this flow chart to make informed and disciplined decisions. I'm going to use this decision-making chart to dig into the scope and sequence provided in the curriculum. we need to determine how we will account for the unfinished learning that occurred due to last spring's school closure. For the purpose of our case study, we're going to zoom in on the first two TEKs addressed in the unit, 5.2a and 5.2b. To determine the extent of the unfinished learning, I'm going to ask myself, what are the previous grade level standards that are aligned to the addressed TEKs within the unit? And when were those TEKs addressed within the scope of the previous grade level's curriculum? I will use the vertical alignment tool to look up the grade level TEKs noted in the scope and sequence and provided in the curriculum. Then find the corresponding TEKs from 4th grade. My next step will be to reference the 4th grade scope and sequence to see when these TEKs were scheduled to be taught last year. After reviewing both the vertical alignment tool and the previous grade scope and sequence, this is what I found. As you see, the 4th grade TEKs were paced to be taught in the 4th quarter. So they were likely not covered, or at least not covered in depth due to schools abruptly transitioning to remote learning last spring. After identifying the previous grade level standards and when they were expected to be taught last year, now I can continue through the decision-making process. We need to determine if this skill is necessary for students to have had exposure to previously in order to have access to the current grade level's material. So the first question is this skill from the previous grade necessary for students to access the current TEK? And looking at 4.2b, it is important to note that students have had access to place value charts, and they would have compared and ordered numbers through at least the 100,000s place. While that may not have been fully developed, the skill of writing and naming decimals through the hundreds, they will have enough background knowledge to access 5.2a without spending additional review time to fully develop 4.2b. So I will leave 2 days in the pacing chart the way it is for 5.2a and move on to the next TEK. When considering 5.2b, which is a readiness standard, students would not have had adequate exposure to writing and comparing decimals last year with 4.2f and 4.2c. We will need to further develop and support students in 4.2f while teaching 5.2b. And that leads me to the next question. Will students need additional time or an additional resource? Since the TEK already has 4 days allotted, and we all know that time is a valuable resource, we're comfortable not adding time, but we will need to ensure at least one of those days is done synchronously. We will also need to provide additional just-in-time scaffolds, such as infusing visual models to support students' conceptual development of decimals. Here's where we also want to name specifically what material will be recommended for synchronous learning and what could be accomplished asynchronously. Here's an example of how the 4 allocated days could meet the needs. The first lesson can be taught by a teacher modeling the use of a place value chart in a pre-recorded video or in guided notes to be completed in an asynchronous learning environment. Day 2 would then be used as a time to progress monitor how students are using the place value chart to write and name decimals to the thousands. This can also be accomplished in an asynchronous environment where students are completing an assignment either on paper or submitting something virtually. Day 3 is where the most new learning and conceptual understanding will occur. This is where teachers and students will be modeling how to compare decimals and would therefore be accomplished best in a live session. That can be either in person or virtually, but the teacher will want to have a back and forth conversation with students to monitor their understanding and to reinforce the place value language in real time. To put this in terms of rigor, if the standard focuses on students' conceptual understanding, such as the 5th grade standard, you will want to guarantee some synchronous learning. When students are asked to practice a skill to build their procedural fluency, such as writing and naming decimals with the use of place value charts, that can be accomplished asynchronously, with teachers monitoring individuals' progress by checking work and providing timely feedback. Finally, day 4 can also be accomplished in an asynchronous environment because it is where students are applying the information from the synchronous lesson and practicing on their own. The final question here will be very important to zoom in on, especially when thinking about different instructional settings. Knowing that we will be fluctuating between at-home learning and in-school learning throughout the school year, we need to name up front which standards require synchronous learning with a teacher. Whether that is virtual or in person, there are just some math topics that are much more suited for learning in the same space as the teacher. For example, the TEAC 5.3D, which introduces multiplication of decimals. Students would not have had any exposure to this prior to 5th grade, therefore requiring much more conceptual development and teacher support on the forefront. Remember the problem we started this session discussing? Let's summarize our decision-making process with that specific problem in mind. With the grade level TEAC 5.2b, students are required to compare and order decimal numbers to the thousands place. When we compare that to the standard directly aligned from 4th grade, students were asked to round to the hundreds. According to where this fell in last year's pacing chart, the spring of 4th grade, students likely did not have adequate exposure to this material. So now as we return to the instructional year, teachers will be faced with the key question of how they will address the unfinished learning caused by COVID-19 school closures while teaching the grade level material. Since these two standards are so closely aligned, moving from hundreds to thousands is not a huge leap. Teachers will not need to hold off teaching 5.2b, but rather they can incorporate some just-in-time scaffolds, such as a place value chart to support students strengthening their understanding of comparing hundreds and simultaneously continuing on to thousands. Going through this planning at the system level is necessary for the teacher to feel comfortable executing this lesson. This teacher will feel confident in staying the course and meeting the demands of the 5th grade material because the scope and sequence is such that the supports are built in. Now there is no need to spend weeks reviewing 4th grade material because there is a clear plan of how to address the gaps that were caused by COVID-19 in a way that stays true to our aspirations for strong math instruction. Ultimately, unfinished learning is addressed in service of grade level content. The case study we just walked through was a district who realized that their materials had what was needed to ensure students would receive high quality math instruction over the course of this year, but needed to focus on addressing unfinished learning. However, we know that there are other crucial decisions that need to be made as you think through adapting materials. You will want to think specifically about how to ensure conceptual understanding and development exists in a remote setting. For example, how will you make sure time is prioritized for conceptual understanding to happen synchronously? You'll need to think about ensuring students to have access to the appropriate manipulatives and visual models across all learning environments. You might want to provide guidance to teachers on where to find chip manipulatives online or what materials at home could substitute for classroom materials, like dried beans, so that students can use a chip model when they're adding inside a place value chart, or ensure virtual synchronous instruction includes a whiteboard so students can represent their thinking with the visual model. Finally, you'll want to really consider how you might progress monitor. While naming moments inside your scope and sequence is a starting place, ensuring you have specific resources, including leveraging your LMS to conduct progress monitoring, will be critical. This might mean providing guidance to educators about checking for understanding and key moments to conduct those checks. So while ensuring your scope and sequence is adjusted is super important, it is not the end of the work that needs to be done this year. You may determine that you have the capacity to adapt your materials in these necessary ways. Or you may determine that you need to consider new ones to better meet your needs. I'm going to pass it back to Brian so we can talk about how to operationalize if you decide to adapt.
Thanks, Cami. So let's operationalize these adaptations. So you made the decision to adapt materials. So let's look at the particular action steps you will need to complete before actually implementing the adaptations to the curriculum. So I'll give everyone just a chance to look at these action steps and see how a particular district might assign individuals within their district to tackle these action steps. So as Cami mentioned, creating guidance on these just-in-time supports to identifying additional materials that might be needed for at-home learning, to communicating to stakeholders. There are a lot of really important steps that would need to be completed on a short timeline. And again, these materials will be posted on the Strong Start page for your reference. So no matter what curricular materials you'll use this school year, you'll need to plan for how y'all will address unfinished learning and how you'll accommodate a variety of instructional settings that are likely going to switch throughout the fall. So we've got accounting for unfinished learning by adjusting our pacing charts to account for additional time needed for further exploration and development of the TEKS, providing a menu of options for teachers to offer just-in-time scaffolds, then accommodating varying instructional settings by adjusting those pacing charts by noting which lessons or which parts of a lesson should be taught synchronously and which could be taught asynchronously depending on what the TEK calls for. Highlighting which standards can be omitted or combined due to time constraints caused by rotating between on-campus and remote learning. And then providing teachers with suggested just-in-time scaffolds like some of the ones that Cami mentioned, including ways to accommodate remote learning. So we recognize the less than ideal situation we find ourselves in now. So all of these actions are not all high priority. So as you're thinking about where you might want to begin, you might consider prioritizing these 3 actions that are in blue. Pulling together a review committee and completing a review of materials, deciding what to adopt, and then organizing the next steps and communicating out to your stakeholders relating to your plan as you work towards adoption. So if you choose to adapt your current high quality instructional materials, here are the 5 action steps to begin the adaptation process. Accessing materials, assessing materials to decide which TEKs might need additional time and considerations for unfinished learning, revising that scope and sequence, creating guidance on just-in-time supports, collecting input and feedback from stakeholders, identifying additional learning materials needed and order any curricular supplies, and then similar to the adoption process, communicating out to stakeholders and then training your teachers and leaders on those materials. And we're going to continue picking up with adopting or adapting, but in other content areas. So on Monday, we have RLA. On Wednesday, we have science and social studies. And then on Friday, we're going to round it up by talking about implementing Texas Home Learning 3.0. And all of our webinars are at 10 a.m. Central Time. So at this point, I would love to turn it over to Kelsey, who will kick us off for some Q&A on our portion.
Great, thank you, Brian. So at this point, we've got about 5 minutes here for Q&A relating to adapting or adopting math materials. If you have questions about Texas Home Learning, we are going to ask you to hold those until the end, and TEA will be able to provide some more information. Seeing a question come in about whether or not this PowerPoint and Zoom will be recorded. Yes, they will. They will be placed on the Strong Start website, and we will re-chat out a link into the chat right now, and so you can receive a copy of the presentation on that website. Seeing a question come in about whether or not the state has a list of priority content from each grade level. You can reference the introduction to the TEKS to really understand where the high priority the question about the Texas resource review, we can certainly add the link into the chat here if you're interested in learning more about the resources that are currently being reviewed to be released. The reviews will be released in the fall, and I'll have Grace add the link into the chat so that those of you who are interested can access it. Seeing a few questions come in about Texas home learning. I'm going to ask you to resubmit that question in just a few moments as we transition over to folks who will be able to answer that for you. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to put those into the Q&A. If we are not able to address them today, we will take note of them. Seeing specific questions about what might be useful to teach synchronously or asynchronously, and what guidance we can give for that. I think as districts think about which material makes the most sense to teach synchronously, really honing in on the conceptual standards that require students to develop an understanding of that new content inside of a grade level. Asynchronous content primarily can be thought of as we're thinking about leveraging and developing students' procedural skill and fluency. There's also a question coming in about what to do about students who don't have technology, specifically about, how do we ensure equity in this moment? And so all of the supports that we're thinking about, we certainly want to make sure that all students have access to them, regardless of their instructional setting across both synchronous and asynchronous. There are lots of opportunities for students to engage in mathematics without the use of a computer, including using manipulatives. And we would suggest that districts really think about how they can prioritize those specific moments to ensure that all students have access. Thank you so much for these questions. We're going to actually, before we turn it over to TEA to share more about Texas home learning and then to answer any questions you might have, we would ask that you take a moment to either use this QR code or this bit.ly link to provide some feedback on our math-specific portion of today's session. And we will give you a moment to pull that up and then turn it over to Dana at TEA. And as a reminder, before we do turn over, you can find the recording of today's webinar on the Strong Start website. It should be up by early next week. Dana, we'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Kelsey. I'm excited to be able to provide a high-level overview of Texas home learning and answer as many questions as I possibly can during the rest of our time here together. You can go on to the next slide. So Texas Home Learning is a freely accessible, completely optional, aligned suite of resources that educators can use fully, in part, or not at all. Texas Home Learning includes 3 main components: the curriculum, technology, and aligned professional development. So I'm going to give kind of a high-level overview of each of those and a bit more of a deeper dive into the technology component. The curriculum is for several content areas, pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, aligned to the TEKS or the Texas Pre-Kindergarten Guidelines. It's also customized for our current learning environment to support continuity of learning between home and school learning environments. We can't yet share the specific curriculum or give a preview of the specific curriculum, but it's coming very, very soon. The technology included in Texas Home Learning is a full learning management system designed to support student engagement and instructional collaboration. And I will be able to provide information on the LMS today. Just a reminder, I see some questions coming into the chat. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll make sure to get to as many as we can in just a moment. The last component of Texas Home Learning is professional development to support educators with implementation in both the classroom and remote settings, implementation of the curriculum and the technology. And again, I want to emphasize that districts can optionally adapt none of Texas Home Learning, part of it, all 3 of the components, 1 grade level, all grade levels, whatever meets your local context. So let's go ahead and take a little bit of a deeper look at each of these components. The curriculum for Texas Home Learning is pre-kindergarten through 12th grade for the listed content areas and grade bands. So specifically, there's a pre-kindergarten product. Math is through 12th grade, English language arts and reading is through 12th grade, Spanish language arts and reading is through 5th grade, science and social studies are both through 5th grade. And as a note, the ELR program includes foundational skills and phonics for kindergarten through 2nd grade. The curriculum for each grade level and subject resource is customized for Texas, and it includes unit plans and daily lesson plans aligned to our Texas standards, built-in progress monitoring, digital format with also a printing capability. We heard loudly and clearly, we got a question today about equity and digital access, so there is a printing capability as well. Formative and summative unit assessments, teacher, student, and family supports, and accessibility supports for all learners. So each curricular product is meant to be a comprehensive package. You can go on to the next slide to talk about the technology. So the technology component of Texas Home Learning is a full learning management system. And I'm excited to be able to announce that TEA has negotiated a statewide license for Schoology for all interested districts for 2 years. This is a free 2-year license for any district that starts between today and March 1st of 2021. The license allows for integration with existing platforms, with Texas Home Learning instructional resources and other products as needed. And if you are currently using Schoology already, you can pause your current contract to benefit from additional 2 years of the LMS through the TEA negotiated statewide license. And again, there will be implementation supports available from TEA, Schoology, and from our ESCs. The last component of Texas Home Learning is professional development. We know tools are stronger when you know how to use them well and have the supports and questions answered. So Texas Home Learning is going to include professional development supports for the instructional materials and the learning management system. And we're looking forward to working closely with education service centers to support district implementation and training for both of those components of Texas Home Learning 3.0. And so I have a couple additional panelists here from the Texas Home Learning team that we're gonna jump in and answer some of your questions in the Q&A. Thank you, continue to add them and we'll start answering some questions now. Melissa and Andrew, you can jump in as well.
Thanks, Dana. Dana, I'm going to start off. There's a question about additional funds for districts adopting new materials that are not part of TLL 3.0. Districts may access their TIMA funds as they normally do to purchase additional materials. So you would go through the normal process, but you can request disbursement for additional materials utilizing your TIMA funds.
Got a question about whether Texas Home Learning includes resources for secondary science and social studies. Unfortunately, it does not. Science and social studies is for kindergarten grade.
At this time, we still continue to look at additional pieces to see if we can add in the future.
We're getting a couple questions about printing. So the earlier iterations of Texas Home Learning 1.0 and 2.0, we included a print option to be able to ship directly to families. Texas Home Learning 3.0, like I said, there will be printable components of the curriculum for access at all learning environments and at all homes. But printing would be on the responsibility and decision of the district at this point for Texas Home Learning 3.0.
Again, we are in the middle of finalizing contracts with products. Therefore, we're not able to yet release what those are. I do want to share that once those are released, we will be providing additional support with understanding the products associated with Texas Home Learning 3.0, the materials that will be provided, and that does include what digital aspects will be there. I know there's a lot of questions about adaptive programs associated with math. There are some components that are digital related to support the curriculum that will be part of THL 3.0 that is specialized for each of the content areas. More information to come. We're hoping even starting as early as next week, we'll start to release additional information and have trainings to help you understand each product, which does also incorporate professional development starts so that teachers and leaders are trained on individual products as well.
We got a question about how Texas Home Learning 3.0 aligns with the TEKS resource system, and we are working on additional guidance on how the two systems can work together.
There's a question about, is this still free to districts that doesn't use Schoology? So you have the option right now, between now and March 1st, to actually sign up to use Schoology for the free 2-year license. There is some additional information if you already have Schoology and what to do with your current contract. They're willing to work with you. So just to let you know, if you don't currently have it, you could still access it, and you can discuss with them if you have it but want to take advantage of this 2-year free license.
We had another question about how does Texas Home Learning support special education students or students with disabilities, with modifications, and also English learners. And that was a huge consideration as we were working on the products for Texas Home Learning to be included. So the products include integrated supports for students with special needs and for English learners. And we're thinking about what additional supports and guidance we could provide around implementation to provide further supports.
There's a question here. There's a question about if you've already committed to use of a different LMS than Schoology, will the THL3 be available to integrate? Yes. So if you already do have your own LMS system, you're able to integrate any of the THL3 curriculum into your current LMS. Another question is using Schoology a campus district license or only for teachers of the four core, I guess, to use. It is a district and or campus license that your district would opt in and provide by accessing the information and working with PowerSchool.
Got a question about what supports and guidance are available for parents, guardians, and families. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Texas Home Learning. We're working to make it as open as possible from a licensing perspective for Texas. So that means that parents, guardians, family members would be able to have a better window into what their students are learning than they have before. And so we're thinking about our implementation supports and what could be parent facing to help them understand how to support their children as well.
I wanted to see if Andrew was on here, if there's any. Great, Andrew just jumped on. I'll give him a minute to read some of the things specifically about Math Innovation Zones, if there's some things he can answer. But I do want to share that as soon as we are able to share what the content is, we will set up information to let you know, one, what it is, two, how you can learn more and preview it. We are working very quickly to try to get this out as soon as possible. We understand you want to see it, and we will share as soon as we're able. Once you have the information, you'll be able to access the site, and we will provide additional training and support about each product.
And I'm sharing in the chat a direct link to the instructional continuity planning page of the TEA website. If you go there, you can go directly to the Strong Start resources, which is where you'll find this webinar and lots of resources about planning for the upcoming school year. But there's also a direct link from there to Texas Home Learning information. So I think bookmarking that instructional continuity planning page might be helpful to get to all of this most up-to-date information, as we're all working very hard to plan for the coming school year.
Couple other questions. Does THL provide all components of the lesson cycle? There are lesson plans that are developed in there, including all the materials associated. And so it would be a true lesson, everything that you need. Plus, because it's being developed for this time and for Texas, it is intended to give direction on how to use this in asynchronous, synchronous environments in the classroom. And so there'll be a lot of direction given there. Another question about compatibility with Google Classroom. The answer is yes, it will be compatible with that. And there's a lot of questions about the pricing. This is free for access to Texas schools. And so there is not a fee associated to the school. Now, there may be things that you want to buy additionally and print materials. And so we'll be sharing additional information on that to come soon. And Dana, maybe we could post up again how to access the Schoology, the PowerSchool website, to begin the process to set up a contract.
Yes. And there's a question about, will there be a fee to adopt just the curriculum portion after the 2-year time period? Melissa, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, we have not been able yet to share like what that will look like and if there will be any additional costs to districts. As we begin to roll this out, we'll be able to share more information. But yes, the intention is not that you only use it for the 2-year period, but you may determine that it is what you like and want to extend. And so we'll have opportunities to share more information of how you can do so.
This might be the last question we have time for, but does Texas Home Learning align with the standards for high quality online teaching? I'm not sure if there's specific standards for high quality online teaching that are referenced there, but as we mentioned, Texas Home Learning has been built specifically for use in our current environment and to support continuity of learning regardless of environment, hybrid, remote, or in person. So that has been taken into consideration as where that curriculum can be most effectively implemented, including to a home environment. And I think that's all the time for questions that we have today. It looks like Andrew was having some technical difficulties. He said that districts can reach out directly to math innovation zones and vendors and listed them in the chat. And those vendors are excited to serve Texas districts and may be able to provide negotiated rates. So that is an additional resource if you're looking for new products to adopt and you want to consider Texas Home Learning or some others that are included in Math Innovation Zones. And thank you, Michelle, for sharing that link. Let me save that. And I want to thank everybody for your participation in today's webinar on adapting math curriculum and some information on Texas Home Learning. Thank you for all you do for students in Texas and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.